Welcome back to Worldie Unboxed, the Founders Edition. In this second part of our episode, Aaron and I reflect on our insightful conversation with Krystina Dowdell, founder of Getaway. We'll delve into the key takeaways from our discussion, examining how Krystina's vision for accessible healthcare and her entrepreneurial journey resonate with our own experiences at Worldie. Stay connected with us by joining our community at worldiebrand.com and subscribing to the Worldie YouTube channel for clips and highlights from our conversations. All right, let's dive into part two and unpack our conversation with Krystina.
Trying to think where to start. So the first question I guess I'll ask you is, Krystina was saying that her big goal is to have 1 million free events by 2048. So we've talked a lot about goals, but we haven't necessarily put a number on it or kind of stated it in a super concrete way. So what do you think our big goal or big goals are?
I don't know, that one's pretty far down the road for her. And then it's a pretty huge number. For us, I think we talked about like some kind of pie in the sky type goals. For instance, like being able to create like experience stores or stores where kids can kind of go and interact and not only like try the product out, but have a chance to like, I guess, play different sports, um, be on different surfaces, and allowing them to participate with like even with like parents or guardians or whatnot. So like having one of those type of, I don't know, top golfish slash I don't want to say like Disney World or something, but just like an experience store that is beyond what you kind of see for kids out there right now, or maybe like in any type of market. So I think that was one of our like big pie in the sky type dreams. I don't know if we put like a date to it at any point, um, but if forced to, I would say like it would be cool to have that 10 years from now. So maybe in early 2030s, 2034 or something like that. So
Yeah, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking, if I have to put a number on it, just to be realistic, 10 years seems like a good round number. Um, and I agree with that. I think that's definitely one of our bigger goals. And I see a lot of people talk about wanting to build $1 billion business. And I think that's partially just because that's a round number and not a lot of people get there. I don't necessarily think that that's the goal that I have, but I'd say maybe like if we could get 10% market share just for our target segment, or like 25% market share, then that would be really good. And that would feel like, okay, we actually made it because a really large amount of our target segment is buying our product. So I think about it in terms of revenue and market share, but I haven't necessarily put a specific number on it. But it's one of those things where once you hit, 25 million in sales, 50 million, 100 million, that's a lot. And at that point, it feels like you kind of made it as a company. So I think there's some major milestones out there for us to hit, but I don't necessarily have one milestone in my head like Krystina has with her, 1 million events by 2048.
yeah, no. I mean, I guess I get the whole $1 billion thing. That's the I guess the unicorn, being able to consider yourself being a unicorn at that point. But no, I don't think I've ever had like this is I don't want to say this is a we made it kind of moment, but like yeah, I think it's about being lasting, something that's going to stand the test of time. That's really like more important than a certain like number or figure reaching that and feeling like, okay, we've arrived. I think being able to make some kind of like lasting impact, that would be more in line with what I would consider success.
Yeah, I think in the startup world, it's kind of an achievement just to be alive, 10 to 15 years down the road. So that's even a goal, like, still be in business and selling, 5, 10, 15 years from now. So I think that's that's also, I mean, that's kind of like the baseline that we expect, but that'll be pretty, it's not easy. So that would be pretty cool to accomplish that as well.
Yeah, agreed.
And then Christina was also talking a little bit about her spouse and how sometimes she has to have conversations around the business and, whether it makes sense to continue with the business, things like that. How has it been for you in terms of having a family? And I know now you have a job, but kind of justifying the time and the money that you spend on the business. Because for me, I don't have a wife or kids, so I don't have to justify it to anyone but myself.
Yeah, and it's not like a matter of like justification. It's a matter of like being kind of transparent with what's going on and communicating. So I definitely don't operate in a silo when you're like in a family. You have to, unless you don't want to spend any time with your family, you have to kind of get them involved and engaged. Because they care about it. They want to know, they want to see things, they want to interact, they want to be a part of it. And I want them to be a part of it as well. So there's a lot of communication that goes forward. So they like they're right there with us in terms of like knowing what we've done regarding milestones or setbacks. So they are witness to it. The girls probably don't understand as much, but they definitely when the samples came out, they're all about it and like, you know, thinking like, oh, we created something, which I guess we did, but like it's just like so everything is so much bigger in their eyes. And so that's really cool and very inspirational and motivational. And so I think having a family while building this business is much more of a of an asset than a perceived challenge, because you get a lot of encouragement. You're able to share certain like significant things that have happened or even insignificant things that have happened, and be able to kind of like share the burden or um, share the joy. So I think it's been really like cool. And when kind of going back to that first question, like something building something that's lasting, something that's like generational, to being able to get them involved in it and see them like be able to provide inputs and to just help the business grow. I think that's been like something that I've kind of looked forward to as well. So
That all makes sense. And I think it's good for us to have you on the team with the family, because if we were two guys who are, single, no wife, no kids, then we wouldn't have the same level of credibility. So a lot of times I'll be talking to someone and they're like kind of skeptical, like, why are you going after the kids market? Do you have any kids that things like that? And then I'll just be like, oh yeah, my co-founder has two kids in our target age range. And then they'll kind of like back off a little bit and realize that, it's okay that I mean, I think it's okay regardless that I don't have that background, but that always helps me when when I run into someone who is skeptical because I don't have any kids myself.
yeah, no, it definitely. I remember several conversations that we've had with people, and they're like, "Oh man, you should lead with the whole family thing." And I mean, maybe I'll better like craft my story to where they're at the forefront, if when it makes kind of sense to like be able to do that. So yeah, no, it definitely adds a bit of like credibility being able to say like, okay, these are the reasons why we have chosen, and this is like, part of the why, um, family and kids. So
Yeah, that makes sense. And then Christina was also saying that she taught herself how to code.
mhm.
So what's one or two things that you've learned that you didn't know before just out of necessity?
I mean, anything that relates to footwear production is something that I had to learn. So I didn't come into this, venture with any real knowledge of like the footwear industry outside of like what's considered probably like common knowledge. So learning like the different parts of the shoe, learning the, somewhat familiarizing myself with the manufacturing process, being able to kind of reach out, speak the language a little bit. I think all that is stuff that, I mean, it's not directly akin to coding, but it's definitely something that you like kind of have to like pick up and you sometimes just do it just by interacting with people in that space. So that's something that I've like learned. Obviously, there's other little smaller things that are not even related to the footwear industry that I've kind of picked up, and that's just like being, you know, a founder and a first time founder, and like going through some of the hurdles or getting over some of the hurdles and knocking your head against the wall a little bit regarding like how to get like a business off the ground and get something running. But those are some of the things that I've kind of like picked up that I've had to, you know, either teach myself or I've learned through like, you know, industrial osmosis, just talking to people in the industry. What about you?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think for me, one of the things that came to mind first was just kind of like video editing, and I'm not good at it at all. And what I do, if I was talking to someone who actually does video editing for a living, they'd probably say what you're doing is not video editing at all. But just kind of like doing some of this stuff, like putting videos up on YouTube, making shorts, and then also some of the stuff on social media, like LinkedIn posting, things like that. Just understanding how to create community, build an audience. Those are things that I didn't care at all about before running a business. And if I weren't running a business, I probably wouldn't be doing those things. So those are a couple of things that I just learned and I'm learning how to do out of necessity.
Yeah, no, I definitely have seen that. But kind of sticking on that whole like coding and what Krystina was talking about and how she mentioned using Chat GPT to help her learn to code, which isn't the first time that I've heard someone in that industry or someone who's learning to code say that, you know, Chat GPT was an asset or AI in general was an asset. How do you think AI should or will play a role in our business?
I mean, I think like any technology, if you don't embrace it, then other people in the industry will embrace it and they'll just kind of pass you by. So I think AI will be important going forward. I don't know exactly how, because a lot of times I'll use ChatGPT. Like when we were in law school, for example, I might use ChatGPT to help me, figure out cases that are out there to write about. And then I look up the case that ChatGPT is talking about and I realize it doesn't exist. So I've had some experiences with AI where I think this is not really very good right now. So I don't necessarily know how it will factor in. I mean, there's footwear specific AI tools as well that help you design and iterate quicker. So I think that's something for sure that we can incorporate. And I'm sure there's other, you know, maybe softwares and things like that that incorporate AI. So I think we'll see that more and more with maybe some of the service providers that we use. But I don't know if necessarily we're going to be using AI ourselves on a day-to-day basis in the next year or two, but maybe we will. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I never want to say never. But yeah, AI definitely played a role and kind of going back to like law school, business school, and being able to like handle some of the more mundane things that you do, such as like blog posts or whatever they're not necessarily blog posts, but it's just like, you know, going to a shared page and putting your thoughts and responding to the thoughts of others. And a lot of times you know, there's a lot going on in life in general, and coming up with like a post or a response sometimes takes a bit more effort than you feel like you could put forth at the moment. So it's easier to kind of hand that mundane task off to like Chat GPT, at least to kind of maybe get you started so that you don't have to like come up with something novel on your own. And so in that regards, that's kind of how I see AI. And this is in general, not necessarily specific to our business, is being able to take away some of those like mundane or very like basic fundamental task, or even like creating like an impetus to some kind of like creative like thought process. Being able to do that is potentially where AI can come into use. And like for an example, I'll use that's specific to us in this situation is if we're trying to create an event and the event needs like some kind of like copy to go along with it, instead of like trying to like sit around and stare at a piece of paper with a pencil in hand, figuring out like what words going to make sense for this particular copy, allowing Chat GPT to kind of do its thing, or any kind of AI program to do its thing and get you started. I think those are some ways in which you can cut down on the amount of time that you're spending on one specific task. And it'll, you know, it frees you up to kind of do other things so that you can expend a greater part of your brain power on maybe some more challenging or significant things related to the business. So that's kind of how I see AI. It's just like a not a crutch, but just like a tool to kind of like help you be more efficient with your time and be more effective when it comes to like, knocking out some of the, the strategic things in the business, whether it be something very simple like a copy or something like getting just your thoughts together when it comes to like putting on an event.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think when AI was first when ChatGPT was first coming out, and I think a lot of other people were kind of like, this is gonna replace a lot of the really hard thinking. And for us, for example, we just say, hey, design a really unique kid shoe for us, and then it's gonna do that. But then you try it and it just basically designs something you've seen already and puts a Nike logo on top of it. So I think it's realizing that it's not necessarily gonna you're not going to be able to just build a business by telling ChatGPT to do it for you, but you can speed up some of those menial tasks. You can, you can use it for idea starters, things like that. So I think once you realize that, it can be pretty helpful, but we're never going to be a company where we're just using ChatGPT to make all the hard decisions for us and do all the design for us and things like that.
No, I 100% agree. I think it's more akin to a calculator than it is to like some kind of like supercomputer that's creating or behind the curtains pulling all the strings. So it's gonna like help you be more just effective at what you can do already, but you're gonna have to bring some of the skill talent to the table. So no, I don't see AI as a replacement as much as it is just like a just an asset. And kind of switching gears just a little bit. So this has come up not only in this conversation with Krystina, but in several other conversations. I think back to like the conversation that we had with Corey, and one of the last things that he kind of left us with is like that whole building in public and like where to do that. And now kind of thinking about based upon like our own experience and trying to build in public, what what constitutes it and like what to share. Because I think there is like in many other aspects of life, uh, there's a chance that you could overshare, like you can overindulge or overdo it or whatever. There's a chance to do it to the extreme. And then there's also on the opposite end of the spectrum, a chance of doing it too little, like not doing it enough, uh, and becoming somewhat irrelevant. I guess what in our situation is like that happy medium. What's oversharing? Like what's doing it too much? What do people really or probably don't care about? And when is it like too light of a touch?
Yeah. So I'll start with the kind of undersharing piece because I see a lot of that on LinkedIn, on social media, just in general, where people they show up, they say, I'm excited to announce that we just launched this new product, or we added this new member to our team, or we expanded into this new region, raised X amount of money. And you see them every 3 months, 4 months, maybe every 6 months. And it's like they always have something positive to share, and you don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. So, number one, you're not necessarily sure what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. You don't feel as close to their company. And then number two, you feel like they're only sharing the good stuff, and there's got to be some challenges behind the scenes, and they're kind of intentionally not sharing those. So I think for us, when we talked about building in public, when we started, we wanted to give a more accurate picture of what it's like kind of day to day for us. So the highs and the lows. And I think a lot of times some of the challenges, if you share those resonate a lot more with people versus just, sharing some of the higher moments. So I think undersharing is not sharing any of those negative or maybe like menial things or doubts that creep into your mind, things like that. And then for me personally, I think oversharing is, trashing someone personally, right? So if you name names and say, we worked with this company and they were terrible, something like that. So you try to like anonymize. I think also airing out dirty laundry. So if we were to have some kind of disagreement about something, you don't really share that publicly and be like, hey guys, we are disagreeing about this. Who is right in this situation? Something like that. And then I also think for me personally, there's just some things about like my personal life and maybe how I'm feeling on a day-to-day basis where I'm not necessarily going to post it. I don't know if that makes sense. Like I'll post how I'm feeling about the business generally, but there's certain emotions or things that come into my mind or difficulties of running a business and doing all this other stuff that I have to do that I don't necessarily want to broadcast.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And that's really like what I was kind of thinking about when it comes to oversharing, is when it becomes very close to being some type of reality TV show or reality show where you're no longer looking at it from, and this is like the consumer or any audience member, you're no longer looking from it from like, oh, I want to be updated about what this business is doing. I'm really like captivated with like their mission, like where their progress and everything like that, to where you've now put in personalities, and these personalities are what you're kind of like watching, and you're watching it from like an entertainment aspect as opposed to uh really like following and being a member of the brand. So I think that's when you start like um I guess crossing the line and going into like oversharing, when it becomes much more about the entertainment aspect of it, kind of seeing this person uh, flail around in public. That becomes like a situation where I feel like you've crossed over into the realm of oversharing. So you should be like focusing. It should still be like a professional, like going back to like our conversations with Meg Bryan and like our Bible of sorts in terms of like what's the strategy. Everything that like is presented should be in line with your strategy, your marketing and your branding strategy. So even if it's like sharing about the product or sharing about an experience, um, and for our situation involving like the product development phase or whatever it might be, it should be in line and in keeping with what you've already set as your standard when it comes to marketing and branding. And when you start crossing out of that and putting too much of your own flavor into it, then it becomes less about the company and more about the individual or whatever it might be, and it becomes that like reality kind of like TV series or whatever. So that would probably be oversharing for me. Undersharing is when you kind of go radio silent for like significant portions of time and not really like engaging and updating the community, especially what are considered significant events. And sometimes you need to like update with somewhat insignificant events to kind of show, and this is something that we've kind of mentioned internally a lot, the breadcrumbs as to like how you got there, so people can kind of follow along. So it may not be the most exciting of news, at least not to us, but being able to present like different like stages of the journey so that people can kind of connect the dots to like, oh, that's how they got to that big monumental event because they did A, B, and C. So like I think that's like an opportunity that you miss if you don't share it. Like, and then people don't have that same type of like, wow, you really did this, because they didn't get a chance to see a little bit of the behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then how do you think about kind of positivity versus negativity? Because you see certain people on social media who are kind of like going on rants, for example, or I sent you a video recently where a guy was kind of just very raw and talking very candidly about his emotions and things like that. Do you think because if you're too negative and if you're too honest, then that could be a turnoff to certain people. Whereas if you're too positive and you just gloss over certain things, then people are going to think it's fake. So how do you think about striking that right balance in terms of being authentic, but at the same time not coming across as a negative person or someone who's always out here ranting, stuff like that?
Yeah. And again, I think it goes back to like you as a company, as an organization, have to, before you start building in public or, really like creating content, you gotta have some sense as to this is our strategy. This is what our marketing strategy looks like. This is our branding strategy. This is what we want the company. When people think about the company, there's certain words that should pop up in their mind. And we want those words to be reinforced every single time we present ourselves to the public at large. So before I make this post, is this going to make people think of those 5, 10, 15 words that I want associated with my brand? If they don't think that, then perhaps I should either reword what I'm about to say or reframe this content, or maybe like hold off on doing it. Because it should all build to something. Like as you're like sending this content out, I think it should all build to something. And if you're doing it right, it should build in accordance with your strategy. Like you've worked this out, you've created this, keep it in line with that. So to me, that's how you get from having to worry about like, oh, that was, too much negativity or whatever it might be, or being overly positive. I think if you really want to be like transparent, say like transparency is like one of your goals.
Yeah.
I think you can do that without like being overly negative. And it can all be about framing. Like if like disaster does strike, it's kind of like how how you report on that like disaster. That's going to frame in people's mind whether it's a negative, like a real detriment to the company, or just a challenge that you're kind of overcoming and a part of this journey. Like it has to go back to like how you word things and how you frame things. So there's a way to do it as long as you remember what your core is, what your goals are, the strategy that you've developed. I think there's a way to like be able to present and be transparent. And that's just like one of the kind of goals and one of the words that we may want associated with the brand. There's a way to do that without like having a real Debbie Downer of a connotation when it comes to like presenting that information to the public.
I think that's right. And I think that's a good way to frame it because for me, for example, I try to be optimistic. I try to be solution oriented and I try to show perseverance just in general and also when I represent the company. So we've talked to a lot of people who have said throughout their journeys that they at certain points they wanted to quit, right? So I'm not going to go on social media and be like, I just want to quit, right? And just leave it at that. What I would do instead is say, a lot of times founders, they want to quit. I'm no different. On days where it's tougher, this is what I fall back on. I fall back on my why. This is what my why is. And then maybe asking other people, how do they pick themselves back up after hardships, or what do they do on days where they want to quit? So it's not just kind of putting something negative out there. It's acknowledging that you have some kind of negative feeling and that that's human, but at the same time that you have strategies, that's you're not going to feel like that all the time. And then you have strategies to kind of get over that and push past it.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And talking specifically, not to toot our or our own horns, but I think you do a really good job. Whether or not, I don't know if you're like looking back at like our strategy before you like post, but I think like based upon like the post that I see that you kind of make, it's in line with like our values. It's in line. It like kind of reinforces those ideas or those values that we've already kind of like outlined for ourselves, maybe not even publicized, but we've been able to kind of internalize these type of like ideas. And whether or not people can like get it right away, it's those things that I feel like come out of that kind of content. And if asked like to sum it up in like a couple of words, I think we would get like, I think there would be some type of pattern. We would see like these same kind of words show up to describe like the content that we're kind of putting out there.
Yeah. And I think it kind of comes down to an athlete's mindset, right? So I remember one of my coaches, he would always say, never blame the ref. And if anytime we tried to complain about a call. He was just kind of like, you guys need to play better. Because if you're complaining about the ref, then you didn't play well enough. And I think that's kind of a mindset that I continue to have now. Like things are going to go against you, but you know, you can't really complain about that. You can only control what you control. And then there's a ton of other kind of sports cliches as well that I think we kind of live by as well. So I think having that mindset and that background definitely helps.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So I guess we can go from patting ourselves on the back and talking about maybe something else. Um, so we've also like wanted to have events, maybe not the exact same events that like Krystina has put on, but we've talked about like having a bunch of events to help build brand awareness. So Krystina has said that they're going to be like, I think hers are all about like having free events, which I think is something that's kind of in line with our thought process too. But playing like devil's advocate, is there any way to like monetize those events, or do you feel like that's in keeping with like our strategy if we try to in any way monetize them?
There's definitely a way to monetize them, but I think like you were alluding to towards the end of the question, it's really, do we want to monetize them? Um, I think if we want to bring as many people, introduce as many people to the brand as possible, then free events or really cheap events is the way to go. Because we have to think, do we want the events to be a revenue stream or do we want them to kind of be a customer acquisition strategy? And if really the value is coming from customer acquisition, then we don't necessarily need to charge, $5, $10, whatever it is. But I think there's opportunities to do both free and paid events, right? So maybe the vast majority of events are free, but then we put on some kind of tournament or something like that. Because if we do get to the experiential stores down the road, those are not going to be free. There's going to be some kind of paid element to that. So we could almost think about it like there's free events and then there's the store that you paid for the experience, and then maybe there's like extensions of the store in other places. Like we're bringing the store to you. And for those kinds of events, maybe it's paid versus more basic events, they're free.
Yeah. Now I've thought about this in like several different ways. And what I've kind of landed on is that if we were going to monetize it, it would all be about like where are we shifting like the cost. And I feel like there'd be even for like special type events, like you kind of like alluded to, I feel like shifting the cost to the customer probably wouldn't be in keeping with, our, part of our mantra. And it would in a sense be another hurdle, and like our whole part of like our brand is like being able to lower these barriers to entry when it comes to going and trying out different sports. And so we wouldn't want to like create another barrier by making it like a something that you have to pay for. But how can we still cover the cost, because these things, even though they may be free to the consumer, they're not going to be free to us.
Yeah.
So we've got to be able to like keep them going, without just them being like there's other maybe intangible things that we get out of these events. But I think like of sponsorships or partnerships in offloading the cost to partners or to sponsors or to organizations, and being able to do it that way so that you are kind of monetizing it. And maybe it's not like you're getting any kind of profit over it. Maybe it's just like covering the cost of like putting the event on. But perhaps there are ways to get like, charge vendors or charge sponsors or charge orgs to be associated or be a part of it. And that way you are still able to provide a really good, time for kids, for parents, for communities, while at the same time taking care of that cost burden, which is going to have to shift somewhere, whether it's back to us or being kind of like pushed on, not pushed, but the burden being carried by partners, sponsors, vendors, etc.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was also thinking about nonprofits, which, those are partners for sure. But we've talked to a decent amount of nonprofits at this point in time that are, focused on access, getting more kids playing sports, getting them more active, things like that. So potentially there's ways for us to partner with them. And I'm sure they have funds that they've raised. So maybe that's one way to defray some of the costs.
Yeah, agreed. I That was probably not something that I was thinking about originally when we had that conversation with Krystina, and I was thinking about, oh, what's a way we can actually monetize it? But yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. And then kind of like sticking with like the whole events, I guess theme. She mentioned obviously having events for the foreseeable. I think that's just part of like her business model. And she's talking about 1 million free events by 2048. How long should we continue these events? Like, I think we've originally thought about doing them as like a way to build brand awareness up until like a certain point. Like we've talked about like global launch. But do you think it makes sense to kind of like continue these things?
I think it could for sure. It'll depend, how expensive it is to put on and how many kids are actually showing up. So if it's cheap and a lot of people show up, then it almost seems like a no-brainer. If it's expensive and a lot of people show up, then probably it makes sense. If it's expensive and almost no one shows up, then it doesn't make sense. But I think, it can always be part of the business model. And you could even maybe instead of us doing the events ourselves, we could say, okay, here are the materials that you need. This is how you need to set it up, and basically empowering people in the communities to set up those events themselves, versus us kind of like showing up with all the different stuff, traveling all across the country. Like maybe that's a more sustainable way of doing it, where I don't know if it would still be really thought of as a worldie event, but still, I think people would give you credit for coming up with some of these different games or activities that kids could play. And, if parents go to our website to understand how to put on those events, they're going to think about us when they buy sports equipment as well.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with that. And part of the reason why I feel like events could and maybe even should continue is because it builds to that type of goal that we had, that pie in the sky goal of having like, these experiential stores and localized production, hyper localized production, um, and really being transparent about like all our business processes. Like this obviously putting on events aren't the equivalent to that, but I feel like those are those larger breadcrumbs that show how we got to this point and why we felt like getting to this point was important. So I think, yeah, those events could be those stepping stones to those future goals, those big, again, pie in the sky goals that we have, maybe 10, 15 years down the road.
Yep, that makes sense. Then you want to just go over that last question you had about experience driven versus comprehensive.
Yeah, let me see. Let me read through it again. Yeah, I mean, that's in essence kind of what I was like maybe alluding to a bit when I was saying like keeping the experience or these events as a part of like the brand so that it kind of makes sense when we make that switch to an experience store or an experience brand, that it's in keeping with things that we've already accomplished or things that we've already done in our past. So I think that's really where I was trying to go with that particular question. I mean, welcome to like continue to expound upon it. Um, that way, and another one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of like have that as a part of it is because if we just, I know we are starting with shoes, starting with footwear, but if we solely focus on that, it becomes like oh, they're doing another brand extension. Like, I don't want people to feel like it's a brand extension as much as it's just like a natural part of like what we already are accomplishing. So it's not like we're Colgate toothpaste brand extending into like mouthwash or whatever. It's going to be something that just like seems supernatural, or seems like we were kind of doing it all along, and it's just like another product that we're putting out there. So um that's really what that question was, and I don't even know, again, like if you wanted to kind of like expound on it, that's totally cool.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to a few people who have said, they realize how long footwear takes, like how long it takes to get a shoe to the market. So they're like, in the meantime, you guys should just be an event company. You should do a newsletter, things like that. However you can go into the market today, that's what you guys should do. And then basically, after you kind of build up an audience, then sell a product to them. And I always thought that that was going to be hard, basically saying, we're not here to sell you guys anything. We're just putting on events. We're just giving you information. And then after, 6 months to a year, say, you know what, actually, we do have something to sell you guys. We're going to sell you shoes. I always thought that that was a harder way to get into the market versus starting as a brand, whether it's footwear or whatever, and then saying, okay, we're going to bring that to the market in the future. But in the meantime, we're going to put on events, do a newsletter, whatever else. So I think if we went too event heavy too soon, then it might seem a bit insincere or almost like a bait and switch, where after we have some successful events, then we try to monetize the following that we have and sell them a product.
Yeah, though there are a lot of influencers who do that, they follow that exact
I
thing
know.
that
Yeah.
you say. I think of Prime as one of the prime examples of like, started off as being like an experience, or following an influencer, and then boom, we sell you a product. Mr. Beast does it. Like, a lot of that's just like a strategy. Not to say that that's something that we would try to emulate. I think ours is much more of being able to document what we're doing, get people involved, build communities, and within that community, out comes a product. It's not like building a community and building an audience and switching that audience into like a clientele or a customer base. That's not really our goal. It seems there's subtle differences, but there are definitely differences.
There are differences. And I've definitely noticed that playbook of influencers just getting a ton of really rabid fans and then trying to sell anything and everything they can to them. And a lot of times I hear that the product is not even good. Like
Yeah.
it's just, it doesn't taste good or whatever. It's cheap, it falls apart, whatever. So I definitely don't want to be that kind of person where the sole reason we're trying to build up an audience is just to sell something quickly to them. And then once they realize that it's a bad product, we've already kind of made our money and maybe moved on to the next product.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe to like maybe further like drive home the example, or the delineation between the two. Like, what we're hoping to do, what we're aiming to do, what we're working to do is organically build these communities, find these pain points that we believe already exist, work with this community to address those pain points. And if it's what we feel like, it's going to manifest itself as a product, and that's what we're kind of working on right now. And it actually like solves the issues that community has brought to light. Whereas these other communities that get built up by influencers, they're not built necessarily around some kind of like common like issue, or we're wanting to solve something. It's more or less like entertainment or whatever. You're building these followings, you're building like a lot of people who are like maybe spending a certain portion of their day like seeing what you're doing or seeing what you're like creating. And then it's like you were saying earlier, the whole bait and switch, where now you just create this product that you put your name on or your stamp of approval on. Nobody asked for it. Nobody necessarily wanted it. Like, not to like knock on Prime energy drink or whatever, but like it's not like that community was like, we need another energy drink. Like the energy drinks that we have or that they have right now just aren't like meeting our needs. And if we can work together as a community to come up with an energy drink to like address that, that would be awesome. And then it happens. Like that's not how it went down, or at least I don't believe that's how it went down. So I don't believe anybody within the community was asking for that. It just so happened. So like I think those are different. Like it's just like you're kind of just taking advantage of like your followers as opposed to wanting to really like work with people and build something together and really address something that has, you know, a significant need based upon like the people within the community that you built up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. It really, really drove it home because I was kind of thinking, I understand how they're different, but I don't necessarily know how to verbalize it. But I think that's a really good example. Basically, an existing pain point versus just creating a product and throwing it out there because your loyal following is going to buy it.
Exactly. That's the short, that's the skinny.
So kind of going back to content creation, Krystina was saying that she has like thousands and thousands of pictures and videos on her phone because that's just the way she kind of operates when she's on vacation. She takes a lot of photos, a lot of videos, things like that. Do you feel comfortable making content? Does it feel natural, or is that something that you've kind of had to learn?
Yes and no. Yes, I feel very comfortable like taking like for instance, like my daughters play a whole bunch of sports. Like we put them into like pretty much any sport that's out there and available. Um that's not super expensive. And so like we put them into these sports and like we want to see them like engage and like part of like, you know, the parent's unwritten job is capturing all this in the form of videos, short videos, long videos, pictures, post, whatever it might be. So it's like seems very like in line with what I would be doing anyway. But now a lot of that time, a lot of that was usually just spent like capturing it and getting it sent to like their grandparents or or their aunts and uncles or within like the family group chats or whatever. So sharing it and like we kind of going back to like our playbook or our Bible, like sharing it in accordance with like our values and like putting like worldifying it is different. So that's where the yes and no is like the no portion is like it's a bit different and trying to get accustomed to like filtering your content so that it's in accordance with this strategy that we've kind of like developed internally so that we do make sure that the words, the takeaways are in line with the values that we've kind of like set in stone as part of like our company's core. So yes and no for me.
Yeah, for me, it's a bit different because kind of going back to something we talked about before, I don't have a wife and kids, so it would be a bit weird for me to show up and start taking photos and videos of kids playing sports. So I don't really do that. But when it comes to recording videos like this, posting on LinkedIn, it definitely does not feel natural. It's something that I'm getting more accustomed to, and it feels like kind of not a necessary evil, but something that we have to do. But similar to what I was saying before, if I was not running a company, I would not be self-promoting or like making a podcast or anything like that, just because creating content has just never really been something that I was super interested in doing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And kind of in line with that, and I know we've talked about this before, maybe not at length, but like we've definitely addressed it. So I don't want to sit around and beat a dead horse. But it came up in I remember a LinkedIn post that I put out, and it came after like I was listening to this other podcast, and they were really just trying to talk about the distinction between content creation and documentation. And are you creating content or are you actually like documenting what your company, what you're doing as a founder? And so I think you had a question about it. Krystina mentioned it, the difference between documentation and content creation. I know I put out a little bit, like a little blurb on like LinkedIn as to like what I think the difference is. What do you like consider the difference between like content creation and documentation?
The only time I've heard the distinction is from you and Christina. So I'm kind of like I have to like piece it together. But the way I understand it is documentation is recording yourself doing something you would do otherwise, whereas content creation is setting aside time and doing something or talking about something that you wouldn't be talking about otherwise. So I view this as content creation because we're doing this for a podcast. Whereas if me and you were back at U Chicago and we decided to do a whiteboarding session and we just kind of set up an iPhone and had it record the whole time, that would be more documentation because you're like a fly on the wall versus we're inviting you into the room. So that's the way that I understand the difference. But I guess how do you think about it?
No, I think that was pretty succinct. Like that kind of like hits the nail on the head as to like what I consider the main differences between documentation and content creation. And there's sometimes like some gray areas. I remember listening to this other podcast. I listened to a whole bunch of prep, I guess, because I have a long commute, but I digress. I'll get back to the point. So the point is, like, I was listening to this podcast, and it was about one of the founders of, I believe the brand is called like Midday Squares. And what was going on with him is that he has a brand with his sister and I think her husband. And so they wanted to do documentation. They wanted to build in public. And so they wanted to like create a brand awareness by doing it that way. So they wanted to do that and they didn't want to do like content creation because it felt a little bit more inauthentic. And so like this guy would have conversations with, his sister and her fiance or husband, and it might be like heated, like they may be talking about something that was like, they had differing opinions on regarding the business. And he would remember like, oh, this would be really cool to have shared, like to be able to like document this because it kind of shows like what kind of authentic things are happening behind the scenes in getting Midday Squares, up and running. And so what he would say is like, okay, pause. Like in the middle of something that was like supernatural, he would say like, all right, remember what you just kind of said, and let's kind of do it over because the cameras weren't rolling. So, you turn on your iPhone, you turn on your iPad or whatever to record the situation. And that's where it becomes like that whole like gray area. You want to capture these things, but at the same point, like say you miss like getting like the first part of it, like does that mean you can't go back and rehash what you kind of just did in order to capture it? Does that become like content creation at that point because it's not in the moment, it's not authentic? And so like I think there's like some very like it becomes very gray when you start like recording everything unless you press record at the beginning and you kind of like forget that the camera's rolling, kind of like what we were trying to do. And
Yeah.
like you can fill up your memory banks pretty quickly if you kind of do it that way and just always like constantly have a camera on it or constantly have record on. So I think that's an example of like how it can be like kind of gray. But your description or synopsis of like the differences between content creation and documentation, I think are spot on, and that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, there are a few things that you said that brought up some interesting things that I think we've run into. It's at least for me, I feel like once you start trying to do both documentation and content creation, you almost get obsessed with recording. You're like, because I've had those moments where I'm like, oh my God, this is such a great conversation. I really wish we had recorded, but I've never said, okay, let's get on Zoom, let's do this whole thing over again, let's record it. So I think at that point it feels a bit I don't know, that feels a bit weird to me.
Yeah.
And then I think also one of the gray areas is when you're doing documentation, you still know that it's recording, right? You sometimes you forget, but most of the time you know it's on. So then it almost becomes performative, right? So you want to create good content because you know that that it's recording. So I've kind of fallen into that trap sometimes where I know it's documentation, but it's recording. So then I'm like, I act a little bit different or say things a little bit differently than I would if we were not recording. So I think it's definitely interesting. And you could record literally like every single conversation because there might be something interesting that comes from it. But at the end of the day, you're not, your memory, like you said, your memory is going to be gone if you try to do that.
Yeah, I struggled with that from the very like beginning when we started like recording. Like it became like a situation where I like was trying to force myself to be natural, like in the back of your mind, like just be cool, just act natural, like pretend like you're not recording. But you're aware unless like you really like into the conversation and like something's happening that you kind of like are super focused on, you're aware that like there's a little bitty recording icon at the left, left hand corner of your screen, and that like what you're saying could be potentially the next post or the next like segment or short or whatever it might be. So like you're acutely aware of this, and there is like some kind of like performance like feeling inside of you to where you're like wanting to like you get in front of the cameras, you act differently. Everybody, it happens to everybody. Like I feel like, you get in front of the cameras and you become like an actor, you become a performer. So that's difficult because you want to be that authenticity is like one of the things that we kind of like strive for as well. Like we want to be transparent, we want to be authentic, we don't want to be fake. We want to be like, this is real, this is who we are. And so it's very like tough to keep that going while realizing that you're being recorded for content purposes or documentation purposes. So like, I don't know, it's yeah, that's a struggle. It's a really big struggle because you don't want to act, you don't want to become something that you're not in front of the cameras just for the sake of like, this is what's going to be put out there, and you don't want to like, you want it to be put out in the best light possible. So like, I don't know, it's difficult.
Yeah,
That's all I can say about that. It's pretty difficult.
it is difficult. The thing I'll say though is just in general, like if I'm on a Zoom call, not for a business, but just in general, I feel a lot more comfortable on camera now because we've spent so much time on camera, and I feel like it's easier for me to be on a Zoom call and just be myself now. Whereas before, I'd be like, okay, I got to put my best foot forward. I got to make sure I'm uh speaking in the right way. I'm not saying a lot. I come across as smart. Whereas now, like I've watched myself back so many times that I'm like, I've seen myself do and say stupid things in my opinion. So now it's just kind of okay, that's part of life. That's part of being recorded. So I'm not as nervous now when I'm being recorded in another situation.
Yeah. I said at first that was all I was gonna say about it, but like now that you've said that, just reminded me of like first year of law school, Zoom University for me, throughout because I was like
Me
completely,
too.
and so I felt like it was so much harder to talk, in front of the camera on Zoom than it was to like interact in the classroom setting. Like it was just like it felt like another type of like your performance. Like and people are going to go back and watch it. Not necessarily to hear you, but to like catch up on like stuff that they might have missed during the lecture. But like you knew that you're going to be on camera. You knew it was going to be recorded, and in your mind, everybody's like sitting there paying attention to you, sitting on Zoom, and like there's nothing else going on except for you in front of the camera talking. And so like the spotlight was like, distinctly upon you. And so that was kind of difficult. And that's kind of how I was feeling at the beginning of all this, like being in front of like the Zoom camera. But like you said, you do it so much to where it becomes you would like anything you do, like it becomes a bit more natural, it becomes a bit easier to like do. And so even in conversations that I have outside of this like arena, like for instance for Cooley or whatever, having those conversations via Zoom, which is a lot of our conversations now, seem a bit easier. Like they're it's a super natural, it's not there's not that like barrier like there used to be, or at least that feeling that you're like performing and like the spotlight's on you. It seems to be much more of an engaging conversation.
Yeah. And then on the kind of like Zoom piece and Zoom University, I remember I would listen to lectures back sometimes before finals or whatever. And anytime I got cold called, I'd have to fast forward through it because I just couldn't watch myself. Because I like for a long time I hated the sound of my own voice. And then I think a lot of my mannerisms are just they look pretty stupid. But now I've seen myself and heard myself so much that my voice I don't care about hearing anymore. And then if there's a mannerism that I don't like, I just try to change it. So I think that's also another kind of unexpected benefit, just getting comfortable seeing myself on video, which was a major kind of insecurity or something I just completely avoided in the past.
And really, the thing is, it's like all in your head because I don't know of a single mannerism that you're talking about regarding you, like something that I have no idea what you're talking about because you seem fairly normal talking in front of me. Yeah, no, I think like a lot of that stuff's in your head. Like you think about it way more than anybody else who's kind of watching it thinks about it. So.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I think that exhausts all the questions I had coming out of that meeting with Christina, which is like really cool. I think it was like good to kind of like hear from her different kind of like business than we've talked about in the past. Like we haven't talked to anybody who bases their business around events yet,
Yeah.
and kind of hearing her and like what she's doing, how she came about it, the leap of like wanting to do it full time. And I know we eventually like want to get to that point, but to like hear her like do that kind of stuff, it kind of gives you that like glimpse into like your possible future. Obviously it'd be a much different business, but like the same type of like fervor, the same type of like, following something fairly adamantly. Like I think you see that in her and you kind of like envision that for us.
Yeah. Definitely agreed. And it's always fun to have these conversations with people in different industries. And then you listen, like when I was asking the questions, for example, I was thinking, I don't exactly know how we're going to come up with questions and react to this, but then we always come up with a decent amount of questions and end up talking for like an hour to 90 minutes. So I think it's always cool to see some of the similarities between all entrepreneurship and then where there's differences thinking, how can we apply that kind of mindset or that whatever they're doing to our business.
Yeah, there's always something to learn, just regardless of how obscure their business seems based upon like what we're trying to accomplish. There's always like some like their points of connection. And we find it each and every single time that we have these conversations with these founders. And I think that's like pretty awesome.
I think so too.
Well, guess that's all on my front.
That's all on my front too.
Sweet. Well, till the next time.
Until the next time, man.
All right, man.